For today's lab, we are going to be studying the greenhouse effect. Specifically, we are going to investigate if an increased temperature occurs in a controlled environment when there is increased amount of carbon dioxide in that environment. Before we get started, make sure you record the question that we're investigating. If you're unsure what I'm referring to, make sure to check out the introduction PowerPoint for more information. You're also going to want to write a hypothesis regarding what you think is going to occur in today's demonstration. A great way to write a hypothesis is by using an if-then statement. If we manipulate certain variables, then we might see certain results. While you write your hypothesis, I'm going to give you a little more information about today's experiment. We're going to be using two different groups of bottles, a control group and an experimental group. The bottles in our control group are going to contain sand only, but we're going to be testing two different colors of sand. Light sand, which you can somewhat see here through the bottle, and you'll get a better view of when I set up the experiment, and dark sand, which you can see here. The experimental group will also be receiving these same two colors of sand in the same amount, but I'm also going to be adding carbon dioxide to these bottles. I'll be doing that by using dried ice and water. When these two are combined, the dried ice will give off carbon dioxide gas, which we'll be able to add to these bottles. So again, the difference between our control group and experimental group is simply the addition of carbon dioxide. Before we get started, make sure to record the independent and dependent variables. Remember, the independent variable is the variable that we're manipulating, or the factor that's different between our control and experimental groups. The dependent variable is the variable that's affected by our experiment, or the variable that we record to see if our hypothesis was supported or refuted. Again, if you're unsure, you can use the introduction PowerPoint or ask a teacher for help. Normally at this point, I would go through the lab procedure so you all know what to do throughout the experiment. For this virtual lab, I'm going to set everything up and narrate as I do that. You'll still want to make sure to summarize this on your handout. First, I'm going to add about 50 milliliters of sand to each bottle, doing my best to try to ensure that each bottle has the same amount of sand. And remember, I'm putting light-colored sand in half of the bottles and dark-colored sand in the other half. The purpose of the sand is twofold. First of all, we want to make sure the bottles don't fall over during the experiment, so the sand in the bottom weighs them down and will keep them upright. The other purpose of the sand is that it may either absorb or reflect some of the heat from the lamp during the experiment. This is why we're using two different colors. One color may reflect more, while the other color may absorb more. You can factor this into your hypothesis if you would like, and think about it as the experiment progresses. Once we're finished with the experiment, we'll discuss any differences we saw between the two sand colors, why that may have happened, and compare them to features on Earth. Now I'm placing a thermometer in the lid of each bottle so the end is not in the sand, and using modeling clay to seal the opening. Not only does the modeling clay help keep the thermometers in position and from sliding and moving around, but it also keeps the air inside the bottles, whether that's regular air or air enhanced with the carbon dioxide, from leaking out the top through that hole that I inserted the thermometer into. So for now, I'm going to set our control bottles to the side. They are actually all ready to go for our experiment. So I'm just going to be working with our experimental bottles. Remember, our experimental bottles are going to be receiving carbon dioxide, and we're going to be doing that by putting dried ice in a styrofoam cup, which is connected to the bottle through tubing. So I'm going to insert the tubing into the side of the bottle, where this small hole is, and I'm going to be inserting the other end of the tubing into the styrofoam cup, where the hole is in the cup. I also want to make sure I seal around that area completely with the modeling clay so none of our carbon dioxide leaks out. This is a little bit tricky to do. We want to make sure the tubing doesn't slip out, and we also want to make sure the styrofoam cup doesn't crack. It's slightly fragile, so for some of these I'll also be putting modeling clay on the inside of the cup just to make sure it's completely sealed. And once that's finished, we'll be ready to add the dried ice and carbon dioxide, and then we'll start the experiment. Okay, so I have some dried ice here, and I'm going to add some water. You can see there's steam released when I do so, and that's the carbon dioxide being released. So what I'm going to do for each of our experimental bottles is add a small chunk of dry ice to the bottom of a styrofoam cup, add a little bit of water, and then put the top on the styrofoam cup to seal the system so the carbon dioxide is forced through the tubing and into the bottle. I'm going to let the dried ice sit in the cup attached to the bottle for 1.5 minutes to allow the carbon dioxide time to accumulate. Then, being as careful and quick as possible, I'm going to remove the tubing from the side of the bottle and seal the opening with modeling clay. Of course, I'll repeat this procedure with the 3 remaining bottles until carbon dioxide has been added to all 4 experimental bottles. Once I finish adding carbon dioxide to the experimental bottles, we will be ready to begin our experiment. The first thing we will need to do is take an initial temperature reading. This will allow us to have a baseline for all of the bottles, so we will know if the temperature changes throughout the experiment. I'm going to hold each of the bottles up to the camera so you can see the thermometer inside. Read the temperature and record it on your datasheet under time 0. As a note, I have chosen the bottle's position under the light randomly, so that one group hopefully does not receive more heat than another. I'll also be rotating them as the experiment progresses. Once we've taken an initial temperature reading for all 8 bottles, I will turn on the light and start the stopwatch. I'm going to let the bottles sit under the light for 2 minutes before taking an additional temperature reading. We are going to let this experiment progress for a total of 20 minutes, taking a temperature reading every 2 minutes for a total of 10 temperature readings. Make sure to record all of the temperature data on your handout, as you will need it to complete the calculations at the end of the lab. Okay, now that we've reached the end of our experiment, let's talk about the data that we've recorded. If you calculate the average temperature that was recorded during the experiment, you may notice that the control bottles actually had a higher temperature on average than the control bottles by a very small amount. However, this metric isn't the most helpful to use when comparing the two groups to each other because it doesn't take into account the original temperature that we recorded before the experiment started. So let's do a couple other calculations to get a better idea of what's happening during this experiment. First, let's look through all of the temperatures we recorded during the experiment and find the highest for each bottle. Once you've found that number, subtract the original temperature that was taken before we started the experiment. Essentially, you're finding the difference between the highest observed temperature and the original temperature for each bottle. Once you've done that for all 8 bottles, you can go back and find an average for the control and the experimental. Remember, the control bottles are the first 4, and the experimental bottles are bottles 5 through 8. You should see from this calculation that the highest temperature was slightly warmer in the experimental bottles than it was in the control bottles. However, you might be thinking that the highest temperature recorded for each bottle could have just been a fluke. So let's do another calculation. Take the average temperature recorded during the experiment for each group and subtract the average initial temperature. When you do this, you should see that the experimental group overall had a higher increase in temperature than the control group. This shows us that in our experiment, the bottles with carbon dioxide added had a higher increase in temperature than those without. We also want to see if there's any difference between the colors of sand. We can use the same calculations to do this, we just want to separate out the bottles with dark sand from the bottles with light sand. When you take into account the initial temperature, you should see, on average, that the bottles with the dark sand had higher increases in temperature than those with light sand. Light colors are more reflective, while dark colors tend to hold on to heat. This is just like how snow and ice on Earth are going to reflect heat back into space, while man-made darker objects are going to hold onto and trap heat. As you finish filling in your data table and performing your calculations, think about how what we saw during the experiment applies to the global environment as a whole.